What if I told you that the entire world economy, global shipping, multinational corporations, international finance, even the rise and fall of empires, began not with oil, not with gold, but with something you can buy in a supermarket for a few dollars: pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, tiny, fragile, almost weightless objects that somehow reshaped continents. Why did nations risk bankruptcy for spices? Why did kings send explorers into unknown oceans? Why did entire empires collapse because of something as small as a clove? And how did the pursuit of a smell, a flavor, set the blueprint for global capitalism that still traps countries today? The answers lie in a forgotten story, a world connected long before the internet, long before shipping containers, long before modern currency. A world where spices were so valuable that a handful of nutmeg could buy you a house in Europe. This is how the spice trade created the world's first global economy. A world before globalization, yet already global long before the rise of modern states. 3 regions quietly shaped the fate of humanity: the Indonesian islands, the only place on earth where nutmeg and cloves grew; the Indian coastline, controlling pepper, cardamom, and cinnamon flows; the Middle Eastern trade cities, which guarded the roads to Europe. Europe had demand, Asia had supply. The Middle East controlled the middle. This triangular dynamic would not only create wealth, it would create wars, monopolies, and the first truly global economic system. But here's the twist. Europeans weren't chasing spices because they loved gourmet cooking. They needed spices for medicine, for preservation, for rituals, and ironically, to mask the taste of spoiled meat. In a world without refrigeration, spices were life, and because they were life, they became currency. Which creates our first mystery. How did tiny islands, barely visible on a map, become more economically powerful than most kingdoms in Europe? To answer that, we must go to where everything began: the accidental creation of the world's first global marketplace thousands of years ago. Long before Europe even knew these islands existed, trade routes connected Asia and the Middle East in a complex system. Indian traders had pepper, Arab traders had ships, Chinese traders had silk, Southeast Asians had cloves and nutmeg, and everyone had something to gain. But there was a secret. Those at the center of the trade intentionally hid the origin of spices from Europe. Arab merchants fabricated stories about dragons guarding cinnamon or giant birds collecting cloves. Why? Because if Europe discovered the true source, it would destroy their monopoly. For centuries, that mystery held. Europe paid high prices. The Middle East prospered. Asia supplied. An early supply chain, stretched across continents, operated without a single written contract, a network so efficient that a spice harvested in Indonesia could appear on a European table a year later. But no one understood how fragile the system was. All it took was one breakthrough to blow it apart. Europe discovers the secret and the race begins. By the 1400s. European kingdoms were bankrupt, desperate for wealth, and hungry for a way to bypass Middle Eastern trade routes, especially after the Ottoman Empire tightened control over spice flows. Enter the explorers. Prince Henry of Portugal funded voyages along Africa's coast. Vasco da Gama became the first European to reach India by sea. Columbus, ironically searching for India's spices, stumbled into the Americas. But the true revolution came when Europeans realized the unimaginable. The most valuable plants in the world, nutmeg, cloves, and mace, grew exclusively on a tiny cluster of islands called the Moluccas, a few square miles, holding the economic power of nations. This discovery triggered the world's first economic arms race. Portugal built fortified trading posts to control the routes. Spain attempted to challenge them. The Dutch arrived next, more ruthless and more strategic than anyone before. Finally, the English joined the competition. This wasn't just exploration. This was the birth of multinational corporations. The Dutch East India Company (VOC) and the English East India Company (EIC), entities powerful enough to wage wars, sign treaties, mint currency, and even overthrow governments. Their goal: monopolize spices, control prices, dominate the world economy. But monopolies, by nature, create unintended consequences, and the spice trade monopoly was about to push the world to a breaking point. Violence, exploitation, and the dark side of global trade. When the Dutch reached the Banda Islands, home of nutmeg, they faced a problem. The local population refused to trade exclusively with them, so the VOC made a decision that would stain their legacy forever. They launched a brutal campaign, killing or deporting almost the entire island population, replacing them with enslaved laborers, and declaring a total spice monopoly. For a time, they succeeded. Europe's prices were sky-high. The Dutch became one of the richest nations on earth. But then came the economic flaw. Once the monopoly was perfect, prices collapsed. Why? Because global demand couldn't support the artificial supply restrictions. The VOC was forced to burn excess nutmeg to inflate value, a practice that eerily resembles modern OPEC oil cuts or De Beers diamond controls. And the Dutch weren't alone. Portugal overextended financially. Spain's colonial gold caused inflation. England spent fortunes fighting wars to protect trade routes. The more powerful their empires became, the more unstable their economies grew. This is a crucial lesson. Globalization brings wealth, but extreme concentration of wealth brings collapse. It happened then, and it's happening now. The end of the spice monopoly and the beginning of a new world. By the 1700s, the spice trade began unraveling. Smugglers spread seedlings to other regions. French botanists stole nutmeg and cloves under disguise. The British built plantations in India, Sri Lanka, and the Caribbean. New agricultural centers undercut prices. In other words, the monopoly broke, the first global supply chain decentralized, and the world economy transformed. The Dutch VOC, once the richest company ever created, collapsed under debt. The Portuguese Empire faded. The Spanish Empire crumbled. Even the English East India Company fell after corruption and mismanagement. But the system they built, multinational corporations, global finance, worldwide trade networks, did not disappear. It simply evolved. And in doing so, it set the economic blueprint that still defines our world. Why attempts to stabilize global trade kept failing. After the spice monopoly collapsed, empires tried to prevent similar crises. Britain attempted strict plantation regulations. France tried agricultural diversification to prevent price crashes. The Dutch government took over VOC territories to stop corruption. Global commodity exchanges were formed to stabilize prices, but none of it fully worked. Why? Because economic power had already shifted from individual kingdoms to companies to global markets. And once you build a global economy, you cannot unbuild it. Trade routes became too interconnected. Crops spread worldwide. Capital flowed freely. Prices responded not to monarchs, but to markets. The world had entered a new era, the age of global capitalism, first powered by spices, then by sugar, cotton, oil, and eventually, data. But as history shows, the same patterns keep repeating. Which brings us to the most surprising truth of all. The spice trade never ended, just changed form. If you look closely at today's economy, the patterns of the spice trade are everywhere. 1. Limited supply gives massive value. In the 1600s, 90% of the world's nutmeg came from one island group. Today, 80% of the world's rare earth elements come from a single country. 2. Monopolies gives financial instability. The VOC crashed under its own weight. So did Lehman Brothers in 2008. So did the crypto exchanges in March 2022. Global trade shocks gives geopolitical conflict. The Ottoman blockade triggered European exploration. Today, shipping disruptions in the Red Sea or South China Sea affect global markets overnight. 4. Control of supply routes equals political power. Portugal controlled sea passages. The US controls the global dollar system. China controls manufacturing chains. Saudi Arabia controls oil output. Everything happening today is a modern echo of the spice trade era. Even the price spikes we see now, food, raw materials, energy, mirror the volatility of spice prices in the 1500s. History doesn't just repeat itself, it scales. So what does the journey of the spice trade teach us? Here are the 3 biggest takeaways. Takeaway 1. Tiny resources can reshape the world. It wasn't gold or armies that created globalization. It was plants no bigger than your fingernail. Takeaway 2. Monopolies always collapse. No matter how powerful the empire, the company, or the country, economies built on exclusivity eventually break. Takeaway 3. Globalization is older and more fragile than we think. The world was connected long before modern technology, and small disruptions can still shake the entire system. But here's the warning. We are living in the same cycle. What spices were to the 1600s, oil is to the 1900s, microchips are to today. and AI data will be to the coming decades. The question isn't whether the global economy will reshape again, it's who will control the next monopoly and at what cost. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the forgotten origins of the global economy, make sure to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories that reveal the hidden forces shaping our world. The spice trade may have ignited the first global economy, but the next transformation has already begun.